Hello, this is a synopsis of chapter 5, which talks about the threat to growth. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about the federal deficit, government spending, the deficit, and also taxes. So the main takeaway from this chapter is that all of this crazy spending that the government has been doing really since, well, if you think about when 9/11 happened, they increased spending. And then during the Great Recession of 2002 to 2007 to 2009, spending increased dramatically. And then when COVID hit, spending increased. And so we always hear about how much the government's spending and how high our deficit is. Well, it's not as bad as it seems, because the way you really should look at the deficit is as a percentage of GDP. So if we can continue to increase our GDP, which we have been able to do on a regular basis, mainly through increases in technology, we've increased our GDP dramatically, that we're able to kind of produce our way out of debt, if you will, or keep the debt in check, as opposed to other countries like Greece, who have very high debt, but very low GDP. So look, I'm going to show you this link, but take you to Moodle, but you can go on your own and study it. So there's this link in Moodle that shows government spending as a percentage of GDP. And it's a way to think more, it's another way to look at government spending, and it doesn't make it seem quite as bad as it is. So let me show you that real quick. Okay, so this is US debt as a percentage of GDP. This is from the Fed data, Federal Reserve, St. Louis Fed. And so look at our federal debt as a percentage of GDP. Going back to the 60s, it was 40%, really fluctuating between 30 and 40%. And then it increased here pretty much. Then here we're hovering around 60. This is 9/11. So it really wasn't too bad through here. This was getting us out of the Great Recession right here. Spending started to really increase. And you see here, we're approaching, with all the stimulus money and the quantitative easing, we're up around 100% of GDP. Then we kind of stay constant at around 100. And then this is crazy right here. COVID hits, and all of the stimulus checks, all of the money that they've spent, that the government has spent with trying to help the economy out and help people out during COVID. We went from just a little over 100% prior to COVID, all the way up to almost that looks to be like 135%. So yeah, it's 135. So a big increase here. Now it's come down a bit. And so now this is March 2022. We're giving billions of dollars now to the Ukraine. And so that'll probably ratchet it up a little bit. So anyway, this just gives you a perspective of how much really since the Great Recession, what the government debt has been as a percentage of GDP. So again, this is not a good number. We don't want to be this high, of course, but it's, as long as we can be productive, and we are productive, the economy is doing well, we're producing. And as long as we continue through technology to increase our GDP, we should be okay. So anyway, take a look at this when you have a chance. Okay, let me get back to the slide, to the notes here. All right, so we looked at the link, and so this is the main takeaway from this chapter, is that higher spending today means higher taxes tomorrow. At some point, this has to be paid for. And so even though we're looking at it as a percentage of GDP and we can kind of, that mitigates it, still we're just passing on. Spending today just means we're passing on higher taxes to our children and our grandchildren. So eventually we're going to see higher taxes. There's just no way around it. So higher spending today is going to lead to higher taxes in the future and lower private spending, because what happens is you have something called a crowding out effect, which the government basically becomes a debtor, and interest rates rise, and you end up with lower private spending. So an offshoot of this higher taxes is going to be lower private spending, which can make for slower economic growth. All right, so let's see what happens when taxes rise. So tax increases are not good. It's like a cut and pay, basically. And so when taxes rise, that reduces our individual incentives to earn. The reason is that, people aren't stupid. Contrary to what some government officials think and what the media thinks, we're not stupid, and we can look at the math. And if we realize that if taxes increase, then it's basically taking a cut and pay, as I mentioned. And if our taxes increase, we're paying more taxes, we're not going to be as motivated to earn as much money, to work as hard. Also, if we look at the tax brackets, and if we, work additional hours or earn additional money, and that puts us into a higher tax bracket, it's not really worth it. So there is lots of studies have shown that if you increase taxes, it reduces people's incentives to earn. So the government doesn't end up getting all of the funds that they think they're going to get from an increase in taxes. Whereas studies have shown that if you reduce taxes, that increases people's productivity. If you reduce taxes, it increases the incentive to earn and makes people more productive. So it's better to lower taxes versus raising taxes. Okay, so the higher taxes are going to threaten economic growth. It also reduces incentives to earn. This results in lower economic growth, lower wealth for us now and in the future. There's this interesting study in Europe that found that a 12% increase in taxes actually results in per person, 120-hour decrease in hours worked per year per person. Also, higher taxes reduces the firm's incentives to invest as well as innovate. If corporate taxes are high, then companies are not. That's basically increases their cost, so they're not going to have as much money for research and development and so forth. And the other thing that I think in the homework assignment, they ask you to go on, you're asked in one of the questions to go on the web and research tax rates internationally, and just discuss that, because we are in a global economy. Companies don't have to be headquartered here in the US. And so what was happening prior to the Trump administration, our corporate taxes, the average corporate tax rate in this country was 35%. One good thing that the Trump administration did was they reduced taxes. During his administration, corporate taxes were reduced from 35% to 21%. Now, the Biden administration is talking about increasing corporate taxes back up to about 29%. That was talked about when he was first elected, but they haven't done anything about that yet. So anyway, that's a huge reduction. Our personal income taxes were also reduced. On average, each bracket was reduced down about 2%. So if you were in the 24% tax bracket, you're now in the 22% tax bracket. But by the point that I was making about higher corporate taxes and this global economy is a company will simply just go and have their headquarters in another country outside of the US, and all those profits will be outside of the US so they don't have to pay the taxes. So it's a really one really interesting example is Ireland. Ireland used to have a much higher tax rate. They reduced their tax rate down several years ago to 12.5%. That has resulted in significant economic growth. In addition, they give firms a 20% tax credit on spending for R&D. So the next time you have to get a prescription filled, or if you actually see where your medicines are being manufactured, a lot of pharmaceutical companies went over to Ireland because, think about it, pharmaceutical companies spend a lot of money on R&D, and they're getting this 20% tax credit. And their economy has really done well, has grown quite a bit because of this lower tax rate. So anyway, it helped to bring some profits back into the U.S. and some companies headquartering back in the U.S. when the taxes went down. So that's a significant decrease, 35% to 21%. So lower taxes are better because it promotes economic growth and it incentivizes people to work and produce. And as I said, the main takeaway from this chapter is higher taxes, higher spending means higher spending today means higher taxes in the future. There is no free lunch. And you can think about all of the stimulus money and how ridiculous, in my opinion, how ridiculous it was, the way that it was handled, because they just, certainly during COVID, people were suffering, and people needed, many millions of people needed that money, but they were just trying to rush, and it just wasn't well thought out. People got the stimulus money who didn't need the stimulus money. They didn't figure out how to discriminate between people who lost their jobs or people who, still were working from home and had childcare issues because their kids were at home, or people who didn't have any kids and were working from home and making more money than before because they weren't commuting. So I'm sure you all know people who got stimulus money who didn't really need it. And we're all going to pay for that in the end, because as you can see, we went up to 135% percentage of debt to GDP. Of course, when you think about that, it's a double-edged sword, because not only did the debt was spending increasing, but productivity was way down because of COVID. So that's why it's kind of balanced out now and has come down quite a bit. Hopefully it will continue to come down. So that was one issue with the stimulus money. They just were giving it away willy-nilly, if you will. And then also with the unemployment, they just decided typically unemployment is means tested by state. So in other words, if some states like Louisiana and Mississippi, for example, the unemployment benefits are lower because the cost of living is lower. Well, when they did the unemployment for COVID and decided they were going to give everybody a $600 check, I think it was $600. Well, that was more money than a lot of people in Louisiana and Mississippi, for example, were making. And so it disincentivized people to work when they could stay home and get this unemployment, because they didn't have time they had the COVID money. They decided that there was going to be COVID unemployment, but they didn't go take the time to factor in the cost of living for each state. So anyway, that's old news to all of you, I'm sure. It was a disaster. It meant that in that it was a disaster as far as increasing government spending. And we'll be paying for that in the future with higher taxes. Okay, so that's enough of my rant on taxes. As you figured out, I'm not a fan of taxes. Any economist, unless they're being a paid lobbyist for big government, will tell you that lower taxes is better. Okay, so that's chapter 5, the synopsis for chapter 5. Take care.